These facts also reflects the changed environment across the nation for black aspirations for equal treatment and respect. Fitzgerald's world in 1944 was very different from Morgan's, but it was also unlike the one she had been born into in 1878, just a year after the dreams of a democratically reconstructed South died in bloody violence and political betrayal. Not only did the war against Nazism offer promise of reviving that dream, but so had the material circumstances that made Carrie's resistance possible. Having left agricultural labor behind a decade earlier, her family was no longer dependent on the whims of a plantation boss for either subsistence or shelter. The dependence allowance the Army paid to her youngest daughter had enabled the purchase of the 2-story log cabin that the family had previously rented. So there would be no landlord demanding an explanation for her actions on the bus that day. Nor was there anyone to threaten the jobs of her grown children, for by then, those not in military service were employed in the southern or northern urban labor markets that had expanded to satisfy wartime demand, setting a pattern that would consolidate the massive demographic transformation that reshaped black life by the second half of the 20th century. Thus, does Carrie Fitzgerald's story, arguably more than Irene Morgan's, reflect the crucial changes of the decades preceding the advent of the Civil Rights Movement. Nonetheless, like many similar events, recorded or lost to history, Carrie's individual and momentary challenge to the South's Jim Crow regime should not be conflated with later events as simply an early episode in what some have called the long Civil Rights Movement. Rather, it must be seen as at best a prelude to that movement, one emblematic of the ongoing historical transformations that made a broader rebellion possible 10 years later. The challenges to the Jim Crow order between 1955 and 1965 were clearly rooted in the generations of resistance that came before, and they cannot be understood without that prior history. But one must be clear that Carrie Fitzgerald's rebellion was not yet part of a mass social movement. In contrast to protests a decade later, there would be no community mobilization to build on her individual protest, nor much immediate change in her own disposition toward the oppression she had briefly challenged. She would quietly return to her usual routines, minding her garden and grandchildren. What many scholars have called the classic civil rights movement, which spanned the decade between 1955 and 1965, is best understood, then, as a unique moment in the long history of African American resistance and struggle against racist oppression, a moment that included many of the elements missing from Carrie's story. We must recognize as well, however, that that later moment was rooted in and built on the social, economic, and geopolitical transformations that made Carrie's actions possible, and that also shaped the conditions of possibility for the coming storm. In Carrie's story, then, we find the seeds of the larger story that would unfold for her children and grandchildren over the decades to come, all of whom would come of age in a different world than the one she had known. Carrie's story also exposes some of the popular misconceptions about the character of and the social forces driving the movement that came later. The civil rights movement has become a well-narrated era of recent American history. Its images, rebroadcast every January and February in tandem with celebrations of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday and Black History Month, have far too often been reduced to select sound bites of King's eloquence. Even when supplemented with the image of Rosa Parks's iconic sit-in on that Montgomery bus, the movement is most often represented as the individual or collective acts of heroic and charismatic male leaders. Much like Carrie's lone act of rebellion, however, a deeper examination of the movement reveals a resistance less driven by heroic male leaders showing the way than simply the accumulated grievances of ordinary citizens, most often women like Carrie Fitzgerald, Irene Morgan, and Rosa Parks, newly conscious of the means and possibilities.